We're now joined by Jerry Ozog. He is the executive director of the Pennsylvania Fire and Emergency Services Institute. Jerry, thank you for joining me.
Happy to be here.
Tell us a little bit about your organization. What does it do? Who does it represent?
Absolutely. We are a statewide advocacy and education organization for emergency services organizations throughout the Commonwealth. We work with members of the General Assembly and their staff. We work with the governor's office and the agencies represented the governor's office. We also work with the Auditor General's office. And we work with the major associations for local government, the Pennsylvania Association of Township Supervisors, Pennsylvania Boroughs Associations, and we also work with county level associations also. There's different emergency services organizations throughout the Commonwealth that represent counties. And finally, we work with individual fire and emergency services organizations in local communities throughout Pennsylvania, from Erie to Philadelphia, from Scranton to Gettysburg, and everywhere in between.
Talk a little bit about emergency services organizations throughout the state. Are they usually at the county level, at the township level? How are they organized? Is there a uniformity there?
Absolutely. And diversity is the first thing that I'll explain about Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, emergency services are operated at the local level, okay? There's different levels. We have most are private nonprofit organizations that are either volunteer fire companies or EMS organizations. There's some municipalities in most of the cities, the third-class cities, or in the larger townships that are organized under their local government, a department of the city, and things like that. Over the past 20 years, we've seen more regionalization and mergers and consolidations throughout Pennsylvania, but the clear majority of organizations are still small local organizations serving the communities in Pennsylvania.
So you mentioned that many of these are private nonprofits or others are municipal organized. So how does that affect their funding? Where does their funding come from for these two different types of organizations?
So let's start with the private nonprofit. And I like to explain it as a four-legged stool, where if you're sitting on a stool with four legs and it's stable, the four levels of funding. Number one, organizations are given money through what's called a fund drive, where they mail out letters to their community and community members give a donation. That's leg number one. Leg number two is their fundraising activities, which the fundraising activities are anything from bingo games to sportsman's raffles to chicken barbecues to, in the summertime, street fairs and carnivals. The third source of funding is what I like to call is government funding. And that is through local municipal fire taxes or general fund taxes. It's the state government that has every year the state government gives a grant to fire and EMS organizations. And then we have something called the relief associations in Pennsylvania. So that's the government funding end. And then finally is auxiliary enterprises, where in some communities in Pennsylvania, fire organizations run social clubs. They have rental properties, some own campgrounds, some own car washes. So it's a diverse revenue stream for those nonprofits. Now on the municipal end, it's usually through local tax dollars.
Now talk a little bit about the health of these organizations just before the coronavirus crisis hit.
Absolutely. And the system was in crisis to start with before the coronavirus. And I want to explain that our public safety organizations, our volunteer fire, our career EMS, they're critical to the well-being and public safety in Pennsylvania. These organizations that respond from everything to thousands and thousands of calls in the cities and suburbs to 50 to 100 calls in rural areas in Pennsylvania, they are critical. Over the past 20 years, we've seen a decline in volunteerism, and we've seen a decline in funding. Now, if you look at Pennsylvania's demographics, there's counties that they're getting grayer and the populations are decreasing. And then there's areas of Pennsylvania where the populations are increasing, the suburbs of Philadelphia, the South Central Pennsylvania area, the Western Allegheny County area, Northern Washington County area, Southern Butler County area. Those transitions are occurring where there's more volunteer fire companies that are becoming what's called combination organizations. The populations are increasing, so the service demands increase. In the rural counties with population decreasing, we're seeing less and less volunteers because the population is getting older. Funding is the same way. And obviously, the challenge as organizations move forward, as we have in the past, the two greatest struggles that we've had in the past is, number one, enough people to volunteer or be involved in the organizations. And number two is the funding of those organizations.
How did the coronavirus crisis affect these organizations?
So in two ways. When we talk about the ambulance services and the career fire departments and many of the combination departments, they've had to increase their staffing. There's been more calls I'm going to say not more calls per fact, that they've had to change their operating procedures where they needed to purchase new personal protective equipment. Their use of personal protective equipment has increased, and the training that they needed to have was increased. So they had extra funding that they had to spend on a bunch of different things. That's on one end of it. On the other end is, because of the social distancing protocols, the organizations depend on funding through social events, bingo games, sportsman's raffles. And when your sources of revenue have been cut off, that's a big challenge. That's a big challenge. So we recently did a survey of all of our volunteer departments in Pennsylvania, and I received 200 responses back. And just in the 4-week period, this was last month into March into April, just the 4-week period, over $5 million of profits were lost in 200 organizations that responded to me. And as they move forward over the summer, many of the organization's largest fundraisers are summer activities, which will most likely not occur.
Now, many of the emergency medical employees are sometimes the first people to encounter people who might be infected by the coronavirus. What steps have they been taking to ensure their own safety?
They have been having strict protocols where they have to put on gloves and gowns and masks for almost every incident that is through a risk. They have to do what's called risk management, and they assess the risk as they get a call for respiratory problems or difficulty breathing, or they go into a nursing facility. So in the past, you really didn't have to use those type of universal precautions in certain situations. So those organizations are using that more and more. And we've had organizations around Pennsylvania where their employees have been exposed, they've had to be quarantined, and we've had an organization that had to really put a lot of funding into decontaminating their equipment and stations and things like that. There's been a huge amount of changes in protocols and decontamination of equipment. So it's been a huge effect.
Now, with these organizations having kind of a decentralized structure throughout the state, is there some type of coordinating facility or coordinating entity that helps them do training for coronavirus or get the equipment that they need?
There is, and through the emergency end of it, this is usually coordinated through the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency. They handle logistics, where funding, or not funding, but masks, gloves, gowns, and personal protective equipment is given from the state to the counties, and then from the counties to these organizations. However, I do want to stress that a lot of these organizations had to spend their own funding to get their own supplies because some of the equipment was not adequate, and a lot of the organizations did not have. They weren't completely prepared for what they call the burn rate, which means they used the equipment more and more often. Every organization had that equipment, and you use it in certain situations, but because of the need to use it more and more, they had to get supplies. Now, it is stabilized recently. When this first started several weeks ago, there was more of a concern with that. But the information that I'm receiving from the field is we're not out of the woods yet with PPE, but it is stabilized.
Now, the federal government passed a $2 trillion stimulus bill. Was there money in there for these EMS organizations?
Well, of course, that's a challenge. And there is one grant program that has been established through the federal government where organizations would have to apply for that for equipment. And unfortunately, that does not cover every organization.
How about at the state level? What resources are available there?
Well, at the state level, we are currently working with the General Assembly, members of the General Assembly and their staff to develop what's called a crisis grant program. And both on the House and Senate, there's some versions of that. We're still seeking where the funds will come from, but that would give a one-time grant of somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000 to each organization in Pennsylvania.
Now, are there any ideas that you have or your organization has for long-term solutions to some of these problems?
So our organization, one of the greatest things that we promote is cooperation with your local government, because again, many of these organizations are separate nonprofits. Cooperation with your local government, cooperation with other organizations, meaning the next town over, or the borough fire department working with the township fire department. Over the past 20 years, we've seen more mergers and consolidations, and I would suspect in certain areas where the finances continue to get tight, that this may re-examine the need for organizations to come together and share certain resources. That is one of the things that may work in certain areas of the Commonwealth.
We've been talking with Jerry Ozog. He is the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Fire and Emergency Services Institute. Jerry, thank you for talking with me.
Pleasure to be here.
Hey parents, still trying to get the hang of your child learning from home? Let us help. Civics 101, the video game, is a fun way to keep your child engaged and interested in learning about PA government. The more they learn about voting and our 3 branches of government, the further they advance through quizzes, fun reviews, and more. Start the learning today at pcntv.com. PCN, Pennsylvania Politics and Policy.
Liam Migdail is a communications director for the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Now, this is the time of year when fruit harvesting takes place over the next couple of months. What kinds of fruits are grown in Pennsylvania?
Pennsylvania, we see fruit growing throughout the state, but largely concentrated in the south central area of the state. Apple, we're the 4th largest state in the nation for apples. So that's a major crop for Pennsylvania. We have a variety of tree fruit, cherries, peaches, apricots, kind of across the board there.
Now, you mentioned part of the region where this is grown. I've heard the phrase South Mountain Fruit Belt. What counties are we talking about in Pennsylvania?
When we talk about the South Mountain Fruit Belt, we're talking about a section of Adams County. Within Pennsylvania, I believe it's 70-80% of all the apples produced within Pennsylvania come from that small region of Adams County. So it's a very, very significant fruit growing region nationally, not just within our state, but absolutely within our.
So as the harvesting season comes into effect for those farmers, what types of challenges do they face, or what are they usually doing to get ready for that?
Well, one of the biggest challenges we're hearing from our members right now is having access to the workers that they're going to need for harvest. One of the first things that happened when the COVID-19 pandemic really escalated was that we saw consulate operations in Mexico and other nations where agricultural guest workers are coming from shut down visa processing operations, or at least delayed visa processing operations. For our fruit growers, that's absolutely critical, being able to have those workers coming in. That they work usually 3 to 6 months on a seasonal basis and then go back to their home countries. And a lot of times it's the same workers coming back and forth to the same farm every year. So a lot of our orchards are really relying on those workers. And when we saw those delays, that created a lot of uncertainty within the fruit growing sector. Since that initial shutdown, there's been some loosening up. The Department of State has allowed for some of the workers who will be coming in to not have in-person interviews, and that's allowed visa processing to speed up for those workers. So some are able to come in. There's also been some moves to try to take workers who maybe were already in the country but working at other assignments to be shifted to where they're needed the most. So if you have somebody who was working, say, in California and they were going to go home, but there's some opening for them in Pennsylvania, there's now more flexibility to allow that type of work to happen. But talking to our orchards, a lot of our members really want the workers that they've already trained, that they have a relationship with, and they want to see those same folks coming back. So we've been hearing mixed results. Some have been able to secure some of the workers they need, some haven't. And, but mostly right now, there's just a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen over the next few months.
So with the need for social distancing, what types of measures are farmers taking to ensure the protection of their workers?
So one of the things we're hearing about is that farmers are looking at, okay, first of all, on the job site, how are we spacing people apart? So obviously with the health department order outlining certain guidelines that all employers must take, agriculture is included in that. So, masks are mandatory as much as possible. Start times are staggered, breaks are staggered. You don't want everyone eating lunch at the same time in the same place. Everything that's touched regularly is sanitized, adding hand washing stations, sanitizing stations out in the fields. Talking to some of the fruit growers right now, we're not quite into harvest yet, but they're making plans for when they get to that point, what are they going to do? So if you have 4 rows of apple trees, instead of having a person in each row, you go every other row, so that you don't have workers working directly alongside of one another, that there's enough space in the field to spread out and work not in close contact. Some of the other measures that are taking place, obviously, farmers are communicating to their employees the need to practice these social distancing measures, both inside of work and outside of work. Talking about staying home if you feel sick, making sure to get tested if you're having these COVID-19 symptoms. If somebody was to be diagnosed or there's a probable case of COVID-19, there's a whole nother set of guidelines to follow. We're talking temperature checks for other employees, just a lot of measures to make sure that we're protecting the workforce. And for farmers, that's a big that's one of the biggest priorities. I think a lot of growers see workers as an extension of their family, and they feel a responsibility to make sure they're safe and protected. But on top of that, they realize that without these frontline workers in the food production sector, that their operations are not going to be successful, and that the rest of us aren't going to be able to get the food that we need. So that's of critical importance.
So if some growers aren't able to bring in the workers that they would normally have, are they able to hire locally?
They might try, but traditionally this has been difficult. I mean, we're in a different market right now, so who knows, and maybe that's something that people are going to have to resort to. But in order to bring in agricultural guest workers, producer or grower has to show that they've tried to hire locally and that they can't find anyone who wants to fill that position. And these are tough jobs to fill. It's very labor intensive, and it's not something that a lot of people want to do. And we hear from a lot of our members that they're trying to fill these jobs locally, but it's just very difficult to find people who want to do that work.
So if they're not able to find enough workers to harvest their apples or peaches, what are their options?
Hopefully we don't get to that point, but we're talking about losses of fruit then. I mean, if fruit has to stay on the tree or it drops off, it's food that you've produced that now you're not able to use. And that's a situation that nobody wants to be in.
Are there financial resources available at the state level for farmers?
So right now, mostly what we've been seeing now, there were some working capital loans through DCD. I think that those have largely been exhausted, but so we've been looking at some of the resources at the federal level. The CARES Act has some significant help for agriculture. One of the things we're seeing is that USDA has funding to authorize specialized programs that would essentially either be grants, or we're still waiting to see how those would work out, but it would be direct support to farmers based on their actual losses. USDA has announced a program that would essentially compensate farmers similar to like a crop insurance type scenario, but looking at what your actual losses as a result of this pandemic are and helping to offset that loss so that these operations can continue. We're also seeing federal programs that would ramp up federal purchases of surplus food items, so items that are harvested but can't make it to market, and then putting those into the charitable food system, so helping out in that way. Because one of the other aspects of this is loss of market with restaurants closing, with food service industry being down. Think about how much applesauce goes out through a school cafeteria or an institutional food service setting. The loss of that market it has a huge ripple effect throughout the industry. So, and then it's not necessarily, you can't necessarily adapt overnight the processing aspect of that to take those apples and to take those products and that would be intended for restaurants and move that into consumer scenarios. So if you think about, the package of applesauce you might get in a cafeteria versus what you would go to the grocery store and buy, it's a much different packaging, it's a much different quantity. So there are changes that have to happen now that we're eating food at home as opposed to going out and getting it at a restaurant or getting it at the lunch counter at work or something like that. There are major changes that have to happen and major ways that we need to adapt in the food supply chain. So some of the ways that these programs can help is offering support to producers for the financial losses they're facing as a result of these challenges. And then on top of that, there are federal loan programs through the Small Business Administration that farms are eligible for. Money for those is going very fast. 2 of them just opened up this week and last week, so we're not sure how long those will be open for, but we know that a lot of growers are applying for those that essentially allow them to keep paying their expenses, keep paying their workers while all this is happening.
Now, you mentioned crop insurance. A pandemic may not have been something that people had foreseen. Is that something that would be covered by crop insurance?
So right now, a lot of times crop insurance is directly related to weather events, but it also can affect market losses. So that's something that we've been monitoring, and it's going to be very much a wait and see situation to see how that situation plays out. It's going to depend on what happens throughout the year and how long this goes on for. So the way crop insurance works is you buy it before the growing season and then the claims come in afterwards. So right now we don't have a full picture of what that's going to look like. But as far as these direct payments, we know right now the money that's been set aside is probably not going to come close to helping offset some of the major losses that we're seeing, and that there's probably going to be a need for more assistance down the road. And that's something that's important to note, is that when you're talking about an agricultural operation, a farm, an orchard, it's not like another business in that it can take some time off, it can come back, and with many farms, if it goes under, it's not coming back. You lose good farmland. If good farmland is paved over, it's not returning. So that's part of the reason that we need to make sure these operations are able to stay viable, throughout this, so that we have a secure food system when we come out the other end of it.
Are there any specific policy measures that the Farm Bureau would like to see the state government take up to help farmers?
One of the things that we've been pushing is making sure that that farmers have the assistance they need to weather this financial storm. But on the state level, one of the big things we've been looking at is on the food processing side, making sure that processors are able to get the resources they need to protect their workers. And this is a little more for meat and poultry than fruit, but it applies across the board. We've been advocating for legislation that would essentially allow processors to tap into state grants that allow them to provide protective gear, quickly upgrade their facilities for safety, so that those food processing operations can continue, and there aren't bottlenecks along the food supply chain.
Well, Liam Migdail from the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau, thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you.
PCN is committed to providing the people of Pennsylvania with the most up-to-the-minute information about coronavirus. Daily special programming with civic, business, and government leaders, and how COVID-19 is affecting the community. Airing weekdays at noon and 8 p.m. Live special coverage of the Governor and the Secretary of Health. as well as programming designed to inform and assist everyone impacted. Go to pcntv.com for the latest information.
Spending time talking with Dr. Jarrod Spencer. He's an author, he's a speaker, he's a psychologist, more importantly than anything, and dealing specifically with the mind of the athlete. And Dr. Spencer, before we get into some of the aspects from the athletic side of things, it's obviously universal wide in terms of what COVID-19 has brought on to the American culture. Everyone talks about the physical aspects of COVID-19, but I would think that there's probably a lot more people who have been affected from a mental aspect of what COVID-19 has brought on to the American public.
It's been one of the most significant aspects of the pandemic, and that is the rise of mental health concerns and awareness. And yes, anxiety. Anxiety is fear of the unknown, and whether or not a person actually contracts COVID-19 or not, what they are going to experience is anxiety, fear of getting it. And so, yes, the mental health aspects of this pandemic have been incredibly significant.
And so I want to talk a lot about today with you. I mean, and you've dealt with athletes of all levels at all ages, but specifically talking about high school athletics. Obviously, high school athletics is important to what we do here at PCN, and really quite literally in the midst of the Winter's Championships, the championship playoffs were pulled away. Swimming and diving, literally kids were pulled out of the pool. So basketball, boys and girls basketball championships were canceled. And then eventually through postponements, the spring sports were canceled as well. And so what I always like to remind people is that we're dealing with 15 and 16 and 17-year-old kids. And so all of a sudden to have that rug pulled out from under them, I would think the most blatant aspect of all of it was a great deal of despair for quite a number of high school kids.
Yeah, in fact, I would change that word to despair, which it is, to the broader term of loss. That it was literally the loss. Now, it's not like a death, but it's similar in the sense that they go through the 5 stages of loss, which is the first, which is shock. I can't believe I might lose my spring track season. Denial. This isn't going to really happen. We'll be back. And then this anger phase, which anger is really emotional hurt. So they're really hurting. And when you hold that hurt inward, depression is hurt held inward. And so we're seeing a lot of kids really depressed about the loss of their season. Now, eventually they'll progress to the bargaining phase, which is like, I'm not happy about it, but I understand that it's not coming back. This is my new normal. And eventually the last phase is acceptance. And so these young athletes are definitely going through a significant loss, and a big part of that is the despair that comes along with that.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about losing so much, and obviously, it goes beyond just the athletic side of things, and kids are losing great deals of things, including their prom and even just the graduation ceremony that's so important for so many families, to lose all of that. So it's really a cumulative loss in a lot of ways. But then, it's interesting, you use the word acceptance, that eventually they'll accept the fact that their season is lost. But now if you are a junior or a sophomore, now you maybe turn that next aspect to fear again, because the fear of a potential what happens for the fall. Everybody wants to know what's going to happen in the fall, and quite obviously, we don't know. We're still in the spring. We don't know what's going to happen in the summer, much less the fall. And so they start to wonder, am I going to have my season for the fall? Am I even going to be in school in September? And the ultimate answer is we don't know. And so we get back into that whole aspect of the fear of the unknown.
Yeah, it's a vicious catch-22. And if this pandemic lasts into the fall and high schools are not open, and there is no high school football game in early September, we are going to enter into a whole nother level of mental health concerns like we've never seen in generations before.
The other thing that always amazes me about high school sports, 100 years ago when I was in high school, I was trying to get through the day. The kids today, and it amazes me. They're not only just the athletes themselves and dealing with going to practices and going to games, but they're in the weight room for hours upon hours upon hours and preparing in the off season. And oh, by the way, they're also in future business leaders, and they're in student government, and they're in a chorus, and the number of hours in the day that they use and make use of to make the most of their time. And all of that has been stopped. And so you really go from 100 miles an hour to 0. And now another thing that they're coping with, I'm sure, is all of a sudden that sudden loss and all of a sudden, what am I going to do with the rest of my day?
Yeah, well, there's really two parts to that. One is the physiological impact of all of us running at 100 miles an hour and stopping. So there is that significant crash, physiologically, emotionally, and that's part of the adjustment phase that was really there the first 2 weeks, 4 weeks, maybe even 6 and 8 weeks into this thing. That's one part of it. The other part of it is that this generation of athletes was overscheduled. And they were emotionally overwhelmed, overextended. They described their feelings primarily as feeling tired more than any other word. And so what we've seen is something so incredibly good come out of this pandemic, and that is this. Athletes today in particular, along with the rest of us, are finally getting rest. People are feeling rested and recovered.
It's a very good point.
There's more sleep, there's more energy. We've never felt like this before. And so in some ways, the universe is just a big pause button. And now we're all getting a chance to reset. And that's been one of the best parts about this pandemic, is that everybody is finally slowed down. And that's a good thing.
It is absolutely a great thing. And here's the thing that I hope will slow down. And I always hope that this will happen as we talk about high school athletes, and that's their parents. The parents who put way too much pressure on their kid, the pressures who think that every kid, every little Billy and every little Betty is a major Division I athlete, and they push their kids and they push their coaches and they push all the buttons there possibly could be. I would hope in some way maybe there's an aspect of this that slows them down as well, takes some of the pressure off their kids, take some of the pressure off themselves, and maybe enjoy their kids playing high school sports.
Yeah, I hate to say it, but I really believe that my generation of parents, Generation X in particular, has really wrecked youth sports as we've come to know it in America. Something that was so good, so wonderful, a good healthy outlet, has now become something that's year-round. It's so intense. It's a single sport. It's not even a single sport. It's a single position year-round. And so that has tremendous consequences. And so, yes, the emotional mental health concerns that we see with this generation has its roots in some part back to the parenting, which has been, hey, let's give you every opportunity to succeed that we never had. And I want you to get what I didn't have. And most parents, their hearts are in the right place.
Right.
Their heads aren't. And that's the struggle.
And that's your specialty. I mean, because obviously, and so I'm curious in terms of your, and obviously we can't get into any kind of specifics because of protection of doctor-patient privileges.
Sure.
But just in general, do you see aspects of that coming from the high school kids kind of venting a little bit about the pressure coming from their parents? And is that kind of resolution coming from their parents that maybe they're starting to realize that I am putting too much pressure on their child?
Yeah, the parents are aware of it. In fact, I often tell a parent, how do you know if you're that parent? If your spouse ever said to you at a game, you need to settle down, then you're probably that parent. Yeah. And the number one worst memory for athletes is actually the car ride home, typically with dad.
Yeah.
And so if you don't know if you're that parent, then ask the athlete, how about those car rides with the parent after the game? And what we do say is that the parent should not talk about the sport after a game or a practice until the kid is showered, changed, ate, and rested. The acronym there is SCAR, showered, changed, ate, and rested. Don't scar your kid. Wait until they're showered, changed, ate, and rested. Then you can talk about the sport. Unfortunately, the opposite often happens.
And it's so interesting when you say that, because I've talked to a number of coaches who have coached their kid, and whether it be a son or their daughter, they have that aspect. Like there's certain boundaries. Like we will talk about a game at a certain point. We will not talk about it at dinner, or we will not talk about it here. We'll not talk about there. So they're ultimately putting those boundaries in place, and it's really something that should really manifest itself to every parent-child relationship.
It's a unique dynamic coaching your kid, and that brings upon its own psychological challenges. But one family that I once worked with, actually, the mom had a rule. If you're going to talk about the sport inside this house, it's unacceptable. You need to go in the front yard. And so she said, they were at a kitchen table, and somehow the topic of the sport came up, and she said, "Out you go." And they went outside. They had their conversation. When they came back inside, he was dad, and their dynamic was good because of the healthy boundary like that was established.
There's one last question I want to ask you, and I'm just, for my own curiosity's sake, I would venture to bet that the notion of dealing with the mind of the athlete, of a high school student, has become even more prevalent in the last 5 to 10 years in terms of your experience.
It really is significant. Mental health awareness is on the rise. And thankfully, in part because we've got some professional athletes out there that are now advocating, saying, hey, I've struggled as well. I don't want you to suffer in silence. And as some of those more popular athletes have raised awareness, we're seeing more high school programs starting to readily include some type of sports psychology work. The important thing, though, is funding. And funding for mental health all across America has largely been lagging behind. But I believe that little by little by little, since the NCAA is starting to put more money into mental health, we're going to start to see that trickle down to the high school community. I believe after this pandemic, because mental health awareness has been raised significantly, I do believe that we're going to see more, and this is a key, licensed professional helping. You know, a lot of respect for my colleagues out there that are helping, but without a license. But we really do want, because you can't separate sports psychology and mental health too much anymore. We really do want licensed professionals helping our high school athletes.
That's a great point, and I'm glad you made it. It's a great point for us to finish our conversation. So if there are student athletes out there or parents out there who are watching this program, what would be your best avenue to go to in terms of looking for some semblance of mental health?
Well, obviously, I'm a little bit biased. So, doctoral level licensed sports psychologist. You can find out if a person's actually licensed through the state of Pennsylvania's licensure checklist, and that's one way to find somebody in one's area. But there are a lot of wonderful people in the communities. Obviously, insurance is one way you can find. Call the number on the back of your insurance card under behavioral health. You might find somebody in your community that can provide services, might even work with your insurance company. So that's another way to do it.
Psychologist Dr. Jarrod Spencer talking to us about the mind of the athlete. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Spencer. Appreciate it very much.
My pleasure.